Okay, welcome back. Today we're doing another science-heavy talk. We're going to be talking about the 4 phenotypes of sleep apnea. Basically, these are the 4 presentations that you kind of get with those if you happen to struggle with sleep apnea. So if you know someone who snores, if you happen to snore, this is going to be a really useful video to kind of almost gain some awareness as to like where you might be, and we're going to talk about why. So without further ado, let's dive in. Okay. So first of all, what are the 4 phenotypes? They have 4 names. We're going to have the first one, P-crit, which is short for pharyngeal critical closing pressure, loop gain, upper airway recruitment, and arousal threshold. Now, these can happen in isolation, but many times they actually happen in combination. The first one we're going to go over is P-crit. Now, the reason we're going to do this one first is because this is the one that is associated with anatomical issues. So it is in many ways the gold standard for measuring functional anatomy during sleep. And it is really, and what it refers to is the suction pressure at which the airway collapses. So in other words, what P-crit measures is the ability of the upper airway muscles to keep the upper airway open against the suction pressure of the air coming in, collapsing the airway. So what happens is, as you're breathing in, it creates a negative pressure as the air goes down. The goal of those muscles is to keep the airway open because remember, it's not a bony structure. It's a soft tissue structure. It's mostly made out of muscles. But it will reach a point where it's going to collapse if you breathe too hard. Very similar to if you try to suck too hard through a straw and you'll notice you'll get a pinching in the straw. That's kind of what's happening in your breathing apparatus. And what we know is if you're breathing hard, if you're breathing fast, like that's going to increase the negative pressure and the likelihood of the airway collapsing. Now, the airway does need to be able to withstand a high suction pressure. Again, if you're working out, if you're performing at a high level, you're obviously going to be breathing more. So being able to withstand that is useful. But what we find is it is increased if obstructive sleep apnea can cause the collapse. So it's important to kind of keep that in mind. Now, the airway can be narrowed in one of 4 ways. And remember, the more narrow the airway gets, the negative pressure is going to increase. And this is why P-crit is of these 4, the mostly related to anatomical issues. So we can narrow our own airway a few ways, and we don't want that. We want to keep the airway as wide as possible. If the tongue falls into the back of the throat, now this is really important as to why we keep our tongue, the resting tongue position should be on the roof of your mouth, not on the bottom, because if we're sleeping, the tongue is essentially going to fall into the back of your mouth. That's going to narrow the airway, which increases the negative pressure and then the likelihood of the airway collapsing. The soft palate can also fall back into the throat. The epiglottis can also fall back into the throat. And if any of these narrow the airway, that could collapse due to the rise in negative pressure. So we're going to get into the Venturi effect in a little bit, but what we're finding is other things that can play a role here. So abdominal obesity, that reduces the functioning of the diaphragm. And if the diaphragm is not able to contract downward, that's going to affect how effectively our upper airway muscles can work. In other words, if the diaphragm's not doing its job, able to contract downward, then the upper airway muscles are going to have a bit more of a struggle in terms of staying open. And that's going to increase the negative pressure and again can lead to a potential collapse. So another thing abdominal obesity can do is it compresses the abdomen and the thoracic cavities. Again, that's going to make it harder for your ribs to expand, your diaphragm to contract downward, and get the air you need to kind of go against that negative pressure. So, if this happens, that's going to be a real issue. Also, again, another thing to be aware of is fat deposition, which can happen in the pharynx, and also within the tongue. So you can actually get a fatty tongue. And again, if the tongue is thicker, if it's fatter, that's going to decrease the airway passage. And again, if that airway passage is tighter, the pressure is going to increase and again, potentially cause a collapse. So one way we can reduce that suction pressure, that negative pressure, is by normalizing the breathing volume. So if we're breathing hard, if we're breathing fast, that's going to put more pressure on the airway, and that's going to make it more likely to collapse. And with lighter breathing, it's going to be less likely to collapse. And we're going to be, and this is where the Bernoulli principle and the Venturi effect come into play, because they both have a role when it comes to the physiology of how we breathe. So the top is more an example of the Bernoulli principle. The bottom is the Venturi effect. And basically the Bernoulli principle states, as flow increases, so does negative pressure. In other words, if we're breathing really fast, if we're bringing a lot of air in, the flow is going to increase. That's going to increase the negative pressure going into the system. The Venturi effect is, as diameter decreases, velocity increases. So reducing flow and increasing diameter is going to help P crit, essentially. If you have a wider diameter and if you have a slower flow, that is going to decrease the pressure, decrease the velocity, and decrease the chance of the airway collapsing. Now, remember, your airway, if you're looking for it, it's about the size of your thumb here. So if you are mouth breathing, it's going to be impossible for your tongue to rest on the roof of your mouth. And you can test this yourself. If you have your mouth open, you might be able to touch the tip of your tongue to your mouth, but that's going to take a lot of you're going to have to actively do it. And you're also not going to be able to kind of do anything else if you're mouth breathing. It's going to be incredibly uncomfortable. So with the tongue resting on the palate, that's going to increase the diameter of the airway. And this is why airflow is so important, right? Because if you're breathing hard and fast, the flow of air increases. This is going to increase the negative suction pressure, which again increases the likelihood of airway collapse. If we're breathing through the nose, the flow is going to be lower just simply because it's a smaller cavity compared to your mouth. You're also going to get the benefits of nitric oxide, which we'll get into later, and we've already talked about. But also it's going to then decrease some of that negative suction pressure so that you have it's less likely to collapse. Now, where does breathing reeducation come in? So again, if you're breathing nasally, the nase is going to generate a suction force, a negative force, as the air goes from the nose down through the nasal cavity into the pharynx. Now, this could potentially lead to collapse if you're breathing really hard. But what we know is if you have a closed jaw, if you have proper dental occlusion, if you have your tongue resting on the roof of your mouth, this is going to stabilize flow in the upper airways, meaning that it's going to be less likely to collapse. There's going to be less negative pressure. If the tongue happens to fall back into to the airway, which again, usually is not going to happen during wakefulness, but is going to happen during sleep, you get a narrower pharyngeal lumen, which is going to bring about snoring because you're going to get vibration of the soft palate and then some of the pharyngeal tissue. That's the sound you're hearing with snoring. But also you're going to get a narrowing of the airway, which is going to increase that pressure and again could potentially lead to airway collapse. So what does this all mean? Is that including nasal breathing is going to help re-educate where our tongue should be resting, which is on the roof of our mouth. And over time, that's going to widen the airway. That's going to decrease the amount of suction pressure, negative pressure, and that will also that will mean that the airway has a much better chance of staying open. Then we get to loop gain. So loop gain is kind of a mechanical term that's kind of taken and can be used in this kind of format here. So what loop gain is it measures the ventilatory chemoreflex control. In other words, how sensitive are you to CO2? Now, if you remember from previous lectures, CO2, carbon dioxide, is our primary stimulus to breathe. If you have a high loop gain, that means you have an exaggerated response to a minimal change in CO2. So if breathing stops during an apnea, and apnea, again, if you remember, is simply a stoppage of breathing, CO2 is unable to leave the body via the lungs and then being breathed out. CO2 builds up and then initiates a trigger to start breathing again. Now, interestingly, approximately a third of people who are diagnosed with sleep apnea have a high loop gain. When breathing resumes after an apnea, we know that individuals with high loop gain demonstrate exaggerated ventilation in response to minimal increases in CO2. And what results is a fast respiratory rate and high tidal volume. So what this means, really important to kind of understand. If we look at this picture here on the right, you're going to have your normal breathing, ventilation. You see a fairly normal pattern here. And you're going to get to a point where there's a disturbance. In other words, a stoppage of breathing. What happens here is there is an increase in the partial pressure of CO2, which is, again, your primary trigger to breathe. Also a decrease in oxygen. This is going to stimulate, eventually, a neurological response to start breathing again. And one of two things is going to happen. You're going to get to that stoppage where you might have you're going to get a response where you'll have a slightly bigger breath than normal on that next one, and then it returns to normal again. Or you're going to get a response where you could potentially stop, and then your breathing becomes incredibly erratic because of that abnormal response. And then it could lead to another time where you're going to have another apnea, and then the cycles get really heavy. And you could see already how this is going to lead back into peak crit because you're having faster flow rates, which could potentially lead to collapse of the airway. So high loop gain, kind of like I was just talking about, can lead to a vicious cycle in which breathing resumes with an exaggerated force that the respiratory signals are inhibited. This could lead to something known as a central apnea. It can also lead to increased collapsibility of the throat, which again was peak crit, like I was just talking about. So if you're having exaggerated breathing, like in this bottom image here, or this bottom graph here, that's increased force into the airway, increased suction, increased negative pressure, which again can over time collapse the airway. So you can already see how loop gain and peak crit are fundamentally related. We do know that chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide can be estimated by breath hold time, which is what they call it in studies, but breath hold time is just simply another term for control pause. So when you're doing these breathing reeducation exercises, control pause or breath hold time is the objective measure to use. We know that high loop gain during sleep is determined by a low breath hold time. In other words, as your control pause improves, loop gain should improve as well. We know that breathing exercises that reduce the respiratory rate and lower the minute volume. So what does that mean? Less breaths per second, and then less ventilation, less air you're bringing in. We've talked about that in other lectures. For periods of time during rest can improve control pause and reduce chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide. This is why loop gain is really important when you're talking about sleep apnea, because if you're going through bouts throughout the night where you're just simply not breathing, we need to get oxygen to tissues. We need to get oxygen to the brain. If we're not getting enough oxygen to the brain over time, that is literally going to shrink our brain and make it less functional over time. Now, this is especially important for those who don't respond to CPAPs or mandibular advancement devices. Now, these are simply like types of retainers you can put in that can help kind of appropriate and fix. They could help get your tongue to rest on the top of your mouth. You can see them, they kind of look at retainers. But the interesting thing that to note here about a CPAP machine is it does nothing to decrease loop gain. It actually exerts a positive pressure. It pushes air into the system versus creating that suction negative effect. So it's not going to affect loop gain in any way. So, and this is where, again, these exercises come in. Because again, if we look at the example of an apnea, you're having your normal breaths, you stop breathing, and then because of the altered response to changes in CO2, you basically are doing catch-up breathing. They become heavy, they become a bit more erratic until another apnea comes and the cycle continues. So practicing these exercises is going to help improve your chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide. You become more sensitive to it, and the ventilation, if we go back, becomes a little bit more normal, like you see in this top one here. Then we get to upper airway recruitment. Now, upper airway recruitment is defined as the level of stimulus required to activate the upper airway dilator muscles. So again, so the job of the upper airway muscles is really to keep the airway open against that negative pressure, against that suction pressure. So poor muscle responsiveness to upper airway collapse during sleep, poor upper airway muscle responsiveness increases the duration of the obstructive events as well. So in other words, what's going on here is if the airways are not toned or the muscles are not toned, they are more likely to collapse. And if we are getting, a higher suction negative pressure, either through mouth breathing because the tongue is pushed back or the soft palate is pushed back, that's going to create more pressure, more likely for the airway to collapse. So for this, greater stimuli are needed to activate the muscles to terminate the obstruction. In other words, they're going to need more of a stimulus to stay open. Low upper airway recruitment threshold may increase the severity of sleep apnea. So again, what does this mean? If these muscles aren't toned, if they're not staying open, that the airway, again, is going to get tighter. And when that airway gets tighter, that's going to create a greater negative pressure, more suction, less likely to stay open. Now, there are more than 20 muscles that are responsible for keeping the upper airway open. These are the same muscles that can be involved in breathing, chewing, speaking, and swallowing. And again, there is no bony support in the pharynx, which means there is no rigid structure that's going to keep this open, which means that you can get collapse, which again is leading to sleep apnea, which is the topic of what we're talking about here. So depending on the dynamic balance that exists between the negative suction pressure, again, that suction pressure going down within the airway, and the neural drive to the upper airway dilator muscles, the pharynx can be susceptible to collapse during sleep. So again, this is that plastic straw analogy that I was talking about earlier. If the suction pressure gets great enough, if you suck really, really hard through a straw, you'll notice that you're going to get that pinch. And then what happens? Less air can get through. It leads to an apneic event. You can't breathe. And that's when, again, the breathing gets heavy, it gets erratic, and you're getting less oxygen to your tissues. So in healthy airways, the activation of the upper airway muscles opposes the negative suction pressure during inhalation. This is also the case in patients with sleep apnea during wakefulness. So in other words, even if you have sleep apnea, when you are conscious, when you are awake, the muscles are getting enough of a neurological stimulation to stay open during wakefulness. The issue comes when you're asleep, when you lose, even though it's not technically really super conscious, but as you sleep, it becomes more relaxed. And again, as that negative pressure increases, that could potentially lead to collapse. The muscles are not toned enough to stay open. It leads to collapse. Then you get apneic events. So this is where, again, nitric oxide comes back into the picture. Now, if you remember, nitric oxide is a vasodilator. It allows muscles to relax. It also allows airways and blood vessels to dilate. So when you're nasally breathing, you're inhaling some of that nitric oxide gets into the airway. And when that happens, it can help those muscles stay dilated, stay open. And this is going to be really crucial, particularly if you suffer from sleep apnea. If you're mouth breathing, you're not getting these benefits of nitric oxide. So if we're able to, again, re-educate and get some of that nitric oxide into the airway, we have a better chance of keeping it dilated, keeping it open, reducing that negative pressure. Now, remember, nitric oxide is continuously released in the nasal cavity. So, and it's going to be dependent on the flow rate. So this is where, again, flow rate comes back in. If we're breathing soft, if we're breathing slow, if we're breathing deep, nitric oxide concentrations are going to get higher when flow rate is lower. In other words, it has a longer time period to stick around in those areas and keep them dilated. So if we're breathing hard, if we're breathing fast, that's actually going to lower nitric oxide concentrations because nitric oxide doesn't have long enough to kind of stick around in the airway and do its thing. If we're breathing low, if we're breathing slow, nitric oxide can stick around in these airways a bit longer and enable some of those vasodilatory effects. So then we get to this idea of aerocrine messengers. Now, similar, you might have heard of endocrine. Aerocrine is essentially having a similar effect through the air. And these are kind of concepts that we're using to explain how nitric oxide and carbon dioxide work. Now, again, nitric oxide, its role in this is to maintain tone of the pharyngeal muscles and regulate the neurological pathways to these muscles. So, but nitric oxide's role in nasal obstructive sleep apnea still isn't completely understood, but it's probably significant. So important to kind of keep this in mind. Now, what does breathing re-education do? What do these exercises do? They help strengthen the muscle, the inspiratory muscles. They also improves the function of the inspiratory muscles, especially the diaphragm. Now, we talked about this in other lectures, how nasal breathing triggers better contraction of the diaphragm. So again, if we're mouth breathing, we're not getting that same depth of contraction that we get with nasal breathing. Now, same thing we talked about before, tongue position is really, really important. So if you happen to mouth breathe, chances are your tongue posture is not good. Should be located on the roof of the mouth at rest. This is going to optimize, make the airway as large as possible. If it falls back into the airway, this is again going to create a greater negative pressure, which could potentially lead to collapse. Oh, there we go. Finally, we get to arousal threshold. Now, arousal threshold simply is how light or how deep a sleeper are you? More technically, it's defined by the level of intraesophageal pressure and the amount of change in concentration in arterial carbon dioxide required to trigger arousal. But again, in simplest terms, it's are you a light sleeper or are you a deep sleeper? We know that low arousal threshold and poor upper airway recruitment will wake the dilator muscles up, which means you're more likely to experience unnecessary arousals at night. What does that mean? Generally speaking, you're a light sleeper. If you have a low arousal threshold and you have poor upper airway recruitment, if those muscles aren't toned, if you respond to very tiny changes in CO2 changes, you're going to awake a lot more frequently in the middle of the night. So this is your typical light sleeper. And this is also why we need the upper airway muscles to keep the airway open. So those muscles need to be working. Interestingly, mouth breathing generally results in lighter sleep. If you're stressed, that also generally results in light sleep. So what does this all mean? This comes back to nervous system. How do we activate the parasympathetic response? If we're in a sympathetic dominant state, we're probably going to lean more towards the lighter sleeper side of the spectrum here. Now, light sleepers who have a low arousal threshold tend to wake up more in the middle of the night. This correlates, interestingly, with higher rates of insomnia and autonomic nervous system imbalance. In other words, you are more sympathetically dominant. We also know insomnia can increase the risk and severity of things like depression, suicide and suicidal thoughts, anxiety, cognition, and fatigue. We also know some studies do claim that 67% of those who suffer from apnea also suffer from insomnia. Now, do we know the actual mechanism between? No, but we do know that depression, anxiety, fatigue, low arousal threshold, and sleep apnea all seem to kind of coexist in a constellation where if you have one, chances are some of these others are kind of related. We do know that poor sleep leads to poor emotional health, poor emotional regulation. So we do know that, again, our ability to manage our emotions and handle them efficiently, effectively, our coping mechanisms are less effective when we have poor quality sleep. We also know light sleep is problematic because continuous arousals lead to sleep fragmentation, fatigue, and poor daytime function. Why? Because if we're waking up, we are going to get a spike in cortisol. We know during the day, cortisol should be at its highest when we wake up in the morning and essentially gets lower throughout the day until bed and stays low through the night until we wake up again. Individuals with the greatest risk of all-cause mortality are those with low arousal thresholds. So interested in keep that in mind. If the upper airway muscle, upper airway dilator muscles are not functioning properly, then sleep that is too deep can also be a problem. So if arousal threshold is too high and the person fails to arouse during an apnea, this can lead to not getting enough oxygen and can lead to issues down the road too. So having a very high arousal threshold isn't necessarily good either, although it's much less common than a lower arousal threshold. So basically it's about balance. How do these exercises help? Again, it's going to help through the same mechanisms. It helps these other three kind of phenotypes. It'll help keep the dilator muscles open. And it'll help in that case, or at least when it comes to arousal threshold, the increase in nitric oxide, the resistance to that negative pressure is going to keep us asleep longer. It'll also help normalize our sensitivity to carbon dioxide, which means that we're not necessarily arising from sleep as often. So I hope this makes sense. This is easily the most technical of these lectures. You might have to listen to this one again because there's kind of a lot going on. A lot of these four phenotypes kind of feed into each other. So many times you might be experiencing more than one of them if you happen to suffer from sleep apnea. But again, you're in the right place. You're taking this course for a reason, and we have those exercises. So hope this helps. Hope this is clear. You might have to give this another read or listen. But again, we have the exercise to fix it. I will see you in the next video.